Hi, everybody. You're reading with Jimmy. We're going to read John Steinbeck's Johnny Bear, the entire reading today. Let's get started, shall we? Okay, here we go. Let's do this. Johnny Bear by John Steinbeck. The village of Loma is built, as its name implies, on the low round hill that rises like an island out of the flat mouth of the Salinas Valley in central California. To the north and east of the town, a black tull swamp stretches for miles, but to the south, the marsh has been drained. Rich vegetable land has been the result of the draining, land so black with wealth that the lettuce and the cauliflowers grow to giants. The owners of the swamp to the north of the village began to covet the black land. They banded together and formed a reclamation district. I worked for the company which took the contract to put the ditch through. And the floating clamshell digger arrived and was put together and started eating a ditch of open water through the swamp. I tried living in the floating bunkhouse with the crew for a while, but mosquitoes that hung in the banks over the dredger and the heavy pestilent mist that sneaked out of the swamp every night and slid near the ground and drove me into the village of Loma, where I took a furnished room, the most dismal I've ever seen, in the house of Mrs. Rats. I might have looked further, but the idea of having my mail come in care of Mrs. Rats decided me. After all, I only slept in the bare, cold room. I ate my meals in the galley of the floating bunkhouse. There aren't more than 200 people in Loma. The Methodist Church has the highest place on the hill. Its spire can be seen for miles. 2 groceries, a hardware store, an ancient Masonic hall, and the Buffalo Bar comprise public buildings. On the side of the hills are the small wooden houses of the population, and on the rich southern flats are the houses of the landowners. Some yards usually enclosed by high walls of clipped cypress to keep out the driving afternoon winds. There was nothing to do in Loma in the evening except go to the saloon, an old building, right, with the swinging doors and a wooden awning, pardon me. Neither prohibition nor repeal had changed its business, its clientele, or the quality of its whiskey. And in the course of an evening, every male inhabitant of Loma over 15 years old would come at least once to the Buffalo Bar, had a drink, talked a while, and went home. Fat Carl, the owner and bartender, greeted every newcomer with a phlegmatic sullenness which nevertheless inspired familiarity and affection. His face was sour, his tone downright unfriendly, and yet I don't know how he did it. I don't know how he did it. I know I felt gratified and warm when Fat Carl knew me well enough to turn his sour pig face to me and say with some impatience, "Well, what's it going to be?" He always asked that, although he served only whiskey and only one kind of whiskey. I have seen him flatly refuse. Let's go here. I have seen him flatly refuse to squeeze some lemon juice into it for a stranger. Fat Carl didn't like fumadiddles. He wore a big towel tied around his middle, and he polished his glasses on it as he moved about. The floor was bare, wood sprinkled with sawdust, the bar an old counter, the chairs were hard, straight. Only decorations were the posters and cards and pictures stuck to the wall by the candidates for county elections, salesmen or auctioneers. Some of these were many years old. The card of Sheriff Riddle still begged for re-election, although Riddle had been dead for 7 years. The Buffalo Bar sounds even to me like a terrible place. But when you walk down the night street over the wooden sidewalks, when the long streamers of swamp fog like waving dirty bunting flapped in your face, when finally you pushed open the swinging doors of Fat Carl's and saw men sitting around talking and drinking, and Fat Carl coming along towards you, it seemed pretty nice. You couldn't get away from it. There'd be a game of the mildest kind of poker going on. Tim Rats, the husband of my landlady, would be playing solitaire, cheating pretty badly because he took a drink only when he got it out. I've seen him get it out 5 times in a row. When he won, he piled up the cards neatly, stood up, walked with great dignity to the bar, and Fat Carl, with a glass half filled before he arrived, said, "What'll it be?" "Whiskey," said Timothy gravely. In the long room, Men from the farms and the town sat in straight, hard chairs and stood against the old counter. A soft, monotonous rattle of convention went on, except at times of elections. Went on except at times of elections or big prize fights, when there might be orations or loud opinions. I hated to go out into the damp night to hear far off swamp the chuttering of the diesel engine on the dredger and the clang of the bucket, and then go to my own dismal room at Mrs. Rath's. So soon after my arrival, I scraped up an acquaintance with May Romero, a pretty half-Mexican girl. Sometimes in the evenings, I'd walk with her down to the south side of the hill until the nasty fog drove us back into town. I escorted her home. I dropped her off at the bar for a while. I was sitting in the bar one night talking to Alex Hartnell, who owned a nice little farm. We were talking about black bass fishing when the front doors opened and swung closed, and a hush fell over the men in the room. Alex nudged me and said, "It's Johnny Bear." I looked around. His name described him better than I can. He looked like a great, stupid, smiling bear. His black matted head bobbed forward, and his long arms hung around they hung through as though he should have been on all fours and was only standing upright as a trick. His legs were short, bowed, ending with a strange square feet. He was dressed in dark blue denim, but his feet were bare. They didn't seem to be crippled or deformed in any way, but they were square, just as wide as they were long. He stood in the doorway, swinging his arms jerkily the way half-wits do. On his face there was a foolish, happy smile. He moved forward, and for all his bulk and clumsiness, he seemed to creep. He didn't move like a man, but like some prowling night animal. At the bar, he stopped. His bright little eyes went about from face to face expectantly, and he asked, "Whiskey?" Loma was not a treating town. A man might buy a drink for another if he were pretty sure that the other would immediately buy him one, and I was very surprised when one of the quiet men laid a coin on the counter. Fat Carl filled the glass, and the monster took it and gulped the whiskey. "What the I began, but Alex nudged me and said, "Shh!" There began a curious pantomime. Johnny Bear moved to the door and then came creeping back. The foolish smile never left his face. In the middle of the room, he crouched down on his stomach, and a voice came from his throat, a voice that seemed familiar to me. "But you are too beautiful to live in a dirty little town like this." The voice roved to a soft, throaty tone, with just a trace of accent in the words. "You just tell me that." I'm sure I nearly fainted. The blood pounded in my ears. I flushed. It was my voice coming out of the throat of Johnny Bear. My words, my intonation. And then it was the voice of May Romero. Exact. If I hadn't seen the crouching man on the floor, I would have called to her. The dialogue went on. Such things sound silly when someone else says them. Johnny Bear went right on, or rather, I should say, I went right on. He said things, and he made sounds. Gradually, the faces of the men turned from Johnny Bear and turned toward me, and they grinned at me. I could do nothing. I knew that if I tried to stop him, I would have a fight on my hands, so the scene went on to the finish. And when it was over, I was cravenly glad May Romero had no brothers. What obvious, forced, ridiculous words had come from Johnny Bear. And finally, he stood up, still smiling the foolish smile, and he asked, "Whiskey?" I think the men in the bar were sorry for me. They looked away from me, and they talked elaborately to one another. Johnny Bear went back to the room, into the back of the room, crawled under a card table, curled up like a dog, and went to sleep. Alex Hartnell was regarding me with compassion. "First time you ever heard him?" "Yeah, what the hell is he?" Alex ignored my question for a moment. "If you're worried about May's reputation, don't. Johnny Bear has followed May before." How did he hear us? I didn't see him." "No one hears or sees Johnny Bear when he's on business. He can move like no movement at all. You know what our young men do when they go out with girls? They take a dog along because dogs are afraid of Johnny and they can smell him coming. But God, those voices. Yeah, Alex said, I know. Some of us wrote to the university about Johnny, and the young man came down. He took a look, and then he told us about Blind Tom. Did you ever hear of Blind Tom? You mean the Negro piano player? Yeah, I've heard of him. Well, Blind Tom was a half-wit. He could hardly talk, but he could imitate anything he heard on the piano. Long pieces. They tried him with some fine musicians, and he reproduced not only the music, but every little personal emphasis. To catch him, they made little mistakes, and he played the mistakes. He photographed the playing in the tiniest detail. The man says that Johnny Bear is the same, only he can photograph words and voices. He tested Johnny with a long passage in Greek, and Johnny did it exactly. He didn't know the words he was saying. He just says them. He hasn't the brains enough to make out anything, so we know what he says is what he heard. But why does he do it? Why is he interested in listening if he doesn't understand? Alex rolled a cigarette and lit it. He isn't, but he loves whiskey. He knows if he listens in windows and comes here and repeats what he hears, someone will give him whiskey. He tries to palm off Mrs. Ratz's conversation in the store or Jerry Nolan arguing with his mother, but he can't get whiskey for those things. I said, it's funny somebody hasn't shot him while he's peeking in windows. Alex picked at his cigarette. Lots of people have tried, but you just don't see Johnny Bear. You can't catch him. You keep your windows closed, and even then you talk in whispers if you don't want to be repeated. You were lucky it was dark tonight. If he'd have seen you, he might have gone through the action, too. You should see Johnny Bear screw up his face to look like a young girl. It's pretty awful. I looked toward the sprawled figure under the table. Johnny Bear's back was turned to the room. A light fell on his black, matted hair. I saw a big fly land on his head, and I swear I saw the whole scalp shiver, the way the skin of a horse shivers under flies. The fly landed again, and the moving scalp shook it off. I shuddered, too, all over. Conversation in the room had settled to a bored monotone again, and Fat Carl began polishing a glass on his apron towel for the last 10 minutes. A little group of men near me was discussing fighting dogs and fighting cocks, and they switched gradually to bullfighting. Alex beside me said, "Come on, have a drink." We walked up to the counter. Fat Carl put 2 glasses out. "What'll it be?" Neither of us answered. Carl poured out the brown whiskey. He looked sullenly at me, and one of his thick, meaty eyeballs winked at me solemnly. I don't know why, but I felt flattered. Carl's head twitched back toward the card table. "Gotcha, didn't he?" I winked back at him. "Take a dog next time," I imitated his clipped sentences. And we drank our whiskey and went back to our chairs. Tim Ratz won a game of solitaire, piled his cards, and moved to the bar. I looked back at the table under which Johnny Bear lay, and he had rolled over on his stomach. His foolish, smiling face looked out at the room. His head moved and peered all about like an animal about to leave its den. And then he came sliding out and stood up. There's a paradox about his movement. He looked twisted and shapeless, and yet he moved completely with lack of effort. So Johnny Bear crept up to the room toward the bar, smiling about the men, and as he passed, he went up to the bar, and his incessant question says, "Whiskey, whiskey?" It was like a bird call. I don't know what kind of bird, but I've heard it. 2 notes, rising scale, asking a question over and over. "Whiskey, whiskey?" The conversation in the room stopped, but no one came forward to lay money on the counter. Johnny Bear smiled plaintively. "Whiskey?" He tried to cozen them. Out of his throat, an angry woman's voice issued, "I tell you it was all bone, 20 cents a pound and half bone." And then a man, "Yes, ma'am, I didn't know it. I'll give you some sausage to make it up." Johnny Bear looked around expectantly. "Whiskey?" Still, none of the men offered to come forward. Johnny Bear crept to the front of the room and crouched. I whispered, "What's he doing?" Alex said, "Shh, he's looking through a window. Listen." A woman's voice came, a cold, sure voice. The words clipped. "I can't understand it. Are you some kind of monster? I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen you. Another woman's voice answered her, a voice low and hoarse with misery. Maybe I am a monster. I can't help it. I can't help it. You must help it, the cold voice broke in. Why, you'd be better dead. I heard a soft sobbing coming from the thick, smiling lips of Johnny Bear, the sobbing of a woman in hopelessness. I looked around at Alex, and he was sitting stiffly, his eyes wide open and unblinking. I opened my mouth to whisper a question, but he waved me silent. I glanced about the room. All of the men were stiff and listening. The sobbing stopped. Haven't you ever felt that way, Emmeline? Alex caught his breath sharply at the name. The cold voice announced, Certainly not. Never in the night? Not ever in your life? Ever? If I had, the cold voice said, if I had, I would cut that part away from me. Now stop your whining, Amy. I won't stand for it. If you don't get control of your nerves, I'll see you about having a medical treatment for you. Now go say your prayers. Johnny Bear smiled on. Whiskey? Two men advanced without a word and put down coins. Fat Carl filled the two glasses, and when Johnny Bear tossed it one after the other, Carl filled one again. Everyone knew by that how moved Carl was. There were no drinks on the house at the Buffalo Bar. So Johnny Bear smiled about the room, and then he went out with that creeping gait of his. The doors folded after him slowly and without a sound. The conversation did not spring up. Everyone in the room seemed to have a problem to settle in his own mind. One by one, they drifted out, and the backswing of the doors brought in little puffs of tall fog. Alex got up and walked out, and I followed him. The night was nasty with evil-smelling fog. It seemed to cling to the buildings and reach out with free arms into the air. I doubled my pace and caught up with Alex. What was it? I demanded. What was that all about? For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer, but then he stopped, turned to me. Damn it, listen. Every town has its aristocrats. Its family above reproach. Emmeline and Amy Hawkins are our aristocrats. Maiden ladies. Kind people. Their father was a congressman. I don't like this. Johnny Bear shouldn't do it. Why, they feed him. Those men shouldn't give him whiskey. He's going to haunt that house now that he knows he can whiskey for it. I asked, are they relatives of yours? No, but they aren't like other people. They have the farm next to mine, some Chinese farming on shares. You see, it's hard to explain. The Hawkins women, they're symbols. They're what we tell our kids when we want, well, to describe good people. Well, I protested. Nothing Johnny Bear said would hurt him, would it? I don't know. I don't know what it means. I mean, I kind of know. Go to bed. I didn't bring the Ford. I'm going to walk home. He turned and hurried into the slow, squirming mist. I walked along to Mrs. Rat's boarding house. I could hear the chuttering of the diesel off in the swamp and the clang of the big steel mouth that ate its way through the ground. It was Saturday night. The dredger would stop at 7 on Sunday morning, rest till midnight Sunday. I could tell by the sound of everything was all right. I climbed the narrow steps of my room. Once in bed, I let the light burning for a while and stared at the pale, insipid flowers on the wallpaper. I thought of those two voices speaking out of Johnny Bear's mouth. They were authentic voices, not reproductions. I remembered the tones, and I could see the women who had spoken, the chilled voice Emmeline, the loose, misery-broken face of Amy. I wondered what caused the misery. What was it, just the lonely suffering of a middle-aged woman? It seemed hardly that to me, for there was too much fear in the voice. I went to sleep with the light on and had to get up later and turn it off. About 8 the next morning, I walked down across the swamp to the dredger. The crew was busy bending some new wire on the drums and coiling the worn cable for removal. I looked over the job. It's about 11 o'clock, walked back to Loma, and in front of Mrs. Ratz's boarding house, Alex pulled up in the Model T Ford touring car. He called out to me, "Hey, I was just going down to the dredger to get you. I knocked off a couple chickens this morning. I thought you might want to come out and help with them." I accepted joyfully. Our cook was a good cook, but a big, pasty man. Lately, I found a dislike for him arising in me. He smoked Cuban cigarettes in a bamboo holder. I didn't like the way his fingers twitched in the morning. His hands were clean, flowery like a miller's hands. I never knew before why they called them moth millers, those little flying bugs. Anyway, I climbed into the Ford beside Alex and we drove down the hill to the rich land of the Southwest. The sun shone brilliantly on the black earth, and when I was little, a Catholic boy told me that the sun always shone on Sunday, if at least for a moment, because it was God's day. I always meant to keep track to see if that were true. We rattled down the level plain. Alex shouted, "You remember about the Hawkinses?" "Of course I remember." He pointed ahead. "That's the house." Little of the house could be seen, for a thick hedge of cypress surrounded it. There must be a small garden inside the square, too. Only the roof of the tops of the windows showed over the hedge. I could see that the house was painted tan, trimmed with dark brown, a combination favored for railroad stations and schools in California. There were two wicket gates in the front house and the side of the hedge. The barn was outside the green barrier of the rear of the house, and the hedge was clipped square. It looked incredibly thick and strong. "The hedge keeps the wind out," Alex shouted above the roar of the Ford. "Doesn't keep Johnny Bear out," I said. A shadow crossed his face. He waved at the whitewashed square building standing out in the field. "That's where the Chink sharecroppers live, good workers. I wish I had some of them." At that moment, from behind the corner of the hedge, a horse and buggy appeared and turned on the road. The gray horse was old but well-groomed, the buggy shiny and the harness polished. There was a big silver H on the outside of each blinder. It seemed to me that the check rein was too short for an old horse. Alex cried, "There they are now. On the way to church." We took off our hats and bowed to the women as they went by, and they nodded formally back to us. I had a good look at them. It was a shock to me. They looked almost exactly as I thought they would. Johnny Bear was more monstrous than even I had known, if by the tone of his voice he could describe the features of his people. I didn't have to ask which was Emmeline and which was Amy. I clearly saw the straight, sharp, short chin, the mouth cut with the precision of a diamond, the stiff, curveless figure. That was Emmeline. Amy was like her, but so unlike. Her edges were soft. Her eyes were warm. Her mouth full. There was a swell to her breast. And yet she did look like Emmeline. But whereas Emmeline's mouth was straight by nature, Amy held her mouth straight. Emmeline must have been 50 or 55, and Amy about 10 years younger. I had only a moment to look at them, and I never saw them again, and it seems strange that I don't know anyone in the world better than those two women. Alex was shouting, "You see what I meant about aristocrats?" I nodded. It was easy to see. A community would feel kind of safe having women like that about. A place like Loma with its fogs and with its swamps like a hideous sin really needed the Hawkins women. A few years there might do things to a man's mind if the women weren't there to balance things. It was a good dinner. Alex's sister fried chicken in the butter and did everything else right. I grew more suspicious and uncharitable toward our cook. We sat around the dinner room and drank really good bragger. I said, "I can't see why you go to the Buffalo Bar when whiskey—" "I know," said Alex. "But the Buffalo is our mine of Loma. It's our newspaper, our theater, our club." This was so true that when Alex started the Ford and prepared to take me back, I knew and he knew we would go for an hour or two to the Buffalo Bar. And we were nearly in town. The feeble lights of the car splashed on the road, and another car rattled toward us. Alex swung across the road and stopped. "It's the doctor, Dr. Holmes," he explained. The oncoming car pulled up because it couldn't get around us, and Alex called, "Say, Doc, I was going to ask you to take a look at my sister. She's got a swelling on her throat." Dr. Holmes called back, "All right, Alex, I'll take a look. Pull out, will you? I'm in a hurry." Alex was deliberate. "Who's sick, Doc?" "Well, why, Miss Amy had a little spell. Miss Evelyn phoned in and asked me to hurry. Get out of the way, will you?" Alex squawked his car back and let the doctor by. We drove on. I was about to remark that the night was clear when, looking ahead, I saw the rags of fog creeping around the hill from the swamp side and climbing like slow snakes on the top of Loma. The Ford shuddered to a stop in front of the Buffalo, and we went in. Fat Carl moved towards us, wiping a glass on his apron. He reached under the bar for a nearby bottle. What'll it be? Whiskey. For a moment, a faint smile seemed to flit over the fat, sullen face. The room was full. The dredger crew was there, all except the cook. He was probably on the scow, smoking his Cuban cigarette in a bamboo holder. He didn't drink, and that was enough to make me suspicious of him. 2 deckhands and an engineer and 3 levermen were there. The old levermen were arguing about a cutting. The old lumber adage certainly held for them: women in the woods and logging in the honky tonk. That was the quietest bar I ever saw. There weren't any fights, not so much as singing. There were no tricks. Somehow the sullen, baleful eyes of Fat Carl made drinking an efficient business rather than a noisy game. Timothy Ratz was playing solitary at one of the round tables, and Alex and I drank our whiskey. There were no chairs available, so we just stayed leaning against the bar, talking about sports, markets, adventures we had or pretended we had, just a casual barroom conversation, and now and then we bought another drink. I guess we hung around for a couple of hours. Alex already said he was going to go home, and I felt like it. The dredger crew trooped out, for they had to start work at midnight. The doors unfolded silently, and Johnny Bear crept into the room, swinging his long arms, nodding his big hairy head, and smiling foolishly. His square feet were like cat's feet. "Whiskey?" he chirped. No one encouraged him. He got out his wares. He was on his stomach the way it had been when he got me. Sing-song nasal words came out, Chinese, I thought. And then it seemed to me that the same words were repeated, but in another voice, slower, not nasally. Johnny Bear raised his shaggy head and asked, "Whiskey?" He got to his feet with effortless ease. I was interested. I wanted to see him perform. So I slid a quarter along the bar. Johnny gulped his drink, and a moment later I wish I hadn't. I was afraid to look at Alex, for Johnny Bear crept to the middle of the room and took the window pose of his. The chill voice of Emmeline said, "She's in here, doctor." I closed my eyes against the looks of Johnny Bear, and the moment I did, he went out. It was Emmeline Hawkins who had spoken. I heard the doctor's voice in the road, so it was his veritable voice that replied, "You said a fainting fit?" "Yes, doctor." There was a little pause, and then the doctor's voice again said softly, "Why did she do it, Emmeline?" "Why did she do what?" There was almost a threat in the question. "I'm your doctor, Emmeline. I was your father's doctor. You've got to tell me things. Don't you think I've seen that kind of mark on the neck before? How long was she hanging before you got her down?" There was a long pause. The chill left the woman's voice. It was soft, almost whisper. 2 or 3 minutes. "Will she be all right, doctor?" "Yes, she'll come around. She's not badly hurt." "Why did she do it?" The answering voice was even colder than it had been first. It was frozen. "I don't know, sir." "You mean you won't tell me?" "I mean what I say." Then the doctor's voice went on, giving directions for treatment. Rest, milk, a little whiskey. "Above all, be gentle," he said. "Above everything, be gentle with her." Emmeline's voice trembled a little. You would never tell, doctor?" "I'm your doctor. Of course I won't tell. I'll send some sedatives tonight." "Whiskey?" My eyes jerked open. There was the horrible Johnny Bear sitting around the room. The men were silent, ashamed. Fat Carl looked at the floor. I turned apologetically to Alex, for I was really responsible. I don't know why he'd do that. I said, "I'm sorry." I walked out the door and went to the dismal room at Mrs. Ratz's. I opened the window and looked out into the coiling, pulsing fog. Far off in the marsh, I heard the diesel engine starting slowly and warm up, and after a while I heard the clang of the big bucket as it went to work in the ditch. The next morning, one of those series of accidents so common in construction landed on us. One of the new wires parted on the inswing and dropped a bucket on one of the platoons, sinking it in the works in 8 feet of ditch water. When we sunk a dead man and got a line out to it to pull us up from the water. The line parted and clipped the legs neatly off one of the deckhands. We bound his stumps and rushed him to Salinas. And then little accidents happened. The loverman developed blood poisoning from a wire scratch. The cook finally justified my opinion by trying to sell a can of little marijuana to the engineer. Altogether, there wasn't much peace in the outfit. It was 2 weeks before we were going again, and a new pontoon, a new deckhand, and a new cook. The new cook was a sly, dark, little long-nosed man with a gift for subtle flattery. My contact with the social life in Loma had gone to pot, but when the bucket of the clanging in the mud again and the big old diesel was chuttering away in the swamp, I walked out to Alex Hartnell's farm one night. Passing the Hawkins place, I peered in through one of the little wicket gates in the cypress hedge. The house was dark, more than dark because of the low light glowed in one window. There was a gentle wind that night, blowing balls of fog like tumbleweeds along the ground. I walked into the clear for a moment, then was swallowed in the thick mist, and then in the clear again. In the starlight, I could see those big silver fall balls moving like elementals across the fields. I thought I heard the soft moaning in the Hawkins yard behind the hedge, and once, when I came out suddenly out of the fog, I saw a dark figure hurrying along the field. I knew from the dragging footsteps that it was one of the Chinese field hands walking in sandals. The Chinese eat a great many things that have to be caught at. Alex's sister came to the door when I knocked. He seemed glad to see me. His sister was away, and so I sat down by his stove, and he brought out a bottle of the nice brandy. I heard you're having some trouble, he said. I explained the difficulty. It seems to come in series. The men figured it out that accidents come in groups of 3, 5, 7, 9. Alex nodded. I kind of feel that way myself. How are the Hawkins sisters? I asked. I thought I heard someone crying as I went by. Alex seemed reluctant to talk about them, and at the same time eager to talk about them. I stopped over about a week ago. Miss Amy wasn't feeling very well. I didn't see her. I only saw Miss Emmeline, and then Alex broke out. There's something hanging over those people. Well, you almost seem related to them, I said. Well, their father and my father were friends. We called the girls Aunt Amy and Aunt Emmeline. They can't do anything bad. It wouldn't be good for any of us if the Hawkins sisters weren't the Hawkins sisters, the community conscience, I asked. Well, the safe thing, the place where a kid can get some gingerbread, the place a girl can get reassurance. They're proud, but they believe in things that we only hope are true. And they believe as though honesty really was the best policy and charity really is its own reward. We need them. I see. But Miss Emmeline is fighting something terrible, and I don't think she's going to win. What do you mean? I don't know what I mean, but I thought that I should shoot Johnny Bear and throw him in the swamp. I really thought about doing it. Well, it's not his fault, I argued. He's just a kind of a recording machine and reproducing device. You only use a glass of whiskey instead of a nickel. We talked of some things, and then after a while I walked back to Loma. It seemed to me that the fog was clinging to the cypress head at the Hawkins house, and it seemed to me that a lot of the fog balls were clustered around it, and the others were slowly moving in. I smiled as I walked along at the way a man's thought can rearrange nature to fit his thoughts. There was no light in the house as I walked by. A steady, nice routine settled into my work. The big bucket cut out the ditch ahead of it. The crew felt the trouble was over, and that helped, and the new cook flattered the men so successfully that they would have eaten fried cement. The personality of a cook has a lot to do with the happiness of a drudger crew than his cooking has. In the evening of the second day after I visited Alex, I walked down to the wooden sidewalk trailing a streamer of fog behind me and went into the Buffalo Bar. Fat Carl moved toward me, polishing a whiskey glass, and I cried, "Whiskey!" before he had a chance to ask what it'll be. I took my glass, went to one of the straight chairs. Alex wasn't there, and Timothy Ratz was playing solitaire, having a phenomenal run of luck. He got it out 4 times in a row, and he had a drink every time. More and more men arrived. I don't know what we have done without the Buffalo Bar. About 10 o'clock, the news came. Thinking about such things afterwards, you never can remember quite what transpired. Someone comes in, a whisper starts. Suddenly, everybody knows what happened. They know the details. Miss Amy had committed suicide. Who brought in the story? I don't know. She'd hanged herself. There wasn't much talk in the barroom about it. I could see that the men were trying to get straight about it. It was a thing that didn't fit into their schemes. They stood in groups talking softly. The swinging doors opened slowly, and Johnny Bear crept in, his great hairy head rolling, that idiot smile on his face. His square feet slid quietly over the floor. He looked up and chirruped, "Whiskey? Whiskey for Johnny?" Now, those men really wanted to know. They were ashamed of wanting to know, but their whole mental system required the knowledge. Fat Carl poured out the drink. Timothy Rath put down his cards and stood up, and Johnny Bear gulped the whiskey, and I closed my eyes. The doctor's tone was harsh. "Where is she, Emmeline?" I've never heard a voice like the one that answered. In control, layer of control, but cold, penetrated by the most awful heartbreak. It was a monstrous tone, emotionless, and yet heartbreak got into the vibrations. "She's in here, doctor." A long pause. "She was hanging for a long time." I don't know how long, doctor." "Why did she do it, Emmeline?" The monotone again. "I don't know, doctor." A longer pause. And then, "Emmeline, did you know she was going to have a baby?" The chill voice cracked as the sigh came through. "Yes, doctor," she said softly. "If that was why you didn't find her first—" "No, Emmeline, I didn't mean that, poor dear." The control was back in Emmeline's voice. Can you make out the certificate without mention?" "Of course I can. Sure I can. I'll speak to the undertaker too. You needn't worry." "Thank you, doctor." "I'll go and telephone now. I'll leave you here alone. Come into the other—" "I won't leave you here alone. Come into the other room, Emmeline. I'm going to fix you a sedative." "Whiskey? Whiskey for Johnny?" I saw a smile on the rolling, hairy head, and Fat Carl poured out another glass. Johnny Bear drank it and then crept back to the room and crawled under a table and went to sleep. No one spoke. The men moved up to the bar, laid down their coins silently. They looked bewildered, for a system had fallen. A few minutes later, Alex came into the silent room, and he walked quickly over to me. "Have you heard?" "Yes." I've been afraid," he cried. I told you a couple nights ago, I've been afraid." I said, "Did you know she was pregnant?" Alex stiffened. He looked around the room and then came back at me. "Johnny Bear?" I nodded. Alex ran his palms over his eyes. "I don't believe it." I was about to answer when I heard a little scuffle and looked at the back of the room, and Johnny Bear had crawled out like a badger out of his hole and stood up and crept toward the bar. "Whiskey?" he said, smiled expectantly at Fat Carl. And then Alex stepped out and addressed the room. "Now, you guys listen. This has gone far enough. I don't want any more of it." If he expected opposition, he was disappointed. I saw the men nodding to one another. "Whiskey for Johnny?" Alex turned to the idiot. "You ought to be ashamed. Miss Amy gave you food. She gave you all the clothes you ever had." Johnny smiled at him. "Whiskey?" He got out his tricks. I heard the sing-song nasal language that sounded like Chinese. Alex looked relieved. And then the other voice, slow, hesitant, repeating the words without the nasal quality. Alex sprang so quickly, I didn't see him move. His fist splattered into Johnny Bear's smiling mouth. "I told you that was enough," he shouted. Johnny Bear recovered his balance. His lips were split and bleeding, but the smile was still there. He moved slowly, without effort, his arms enfolded Alex like the tentacles of an anome, enfold a crab. Alex bent backwards, and then I jumped and grabbed one of the arms and wrenched at it. I couldn't tear it loose. Fat Carl came rolling over the counter with a bung starter in his hand, and he beat the matted head until the arms relaxed and Johnny Bear crumbled. I caught Alex and helped him to the chair. Are you hurt? He tried to catch his breath. My back's wrenched, I guess. I'll be all right. You got your Ford outside? I'll drive you home. Neither of us looked at the Hawkins place as we went by. I didn't lift my eyes off the road. I got Alex to his own dark house and helped him to bed and poured a hot brandy into him. He hadn't spoken all the way home, but after he was propped in his bed, he demanded, You don't think anyone noticed, do you? I caught him in time, didn't I? What are you talking about? I don't know yet why you hit him. Listen, he said, I have to stay close for a little while with this back. If you hear anyone saying anything, you stop it, won't you? Don't let them say it. I don't know what you're talking about. He looked into my eyes for a moment. I guess I can trust you, he said. That second voice, that was Miss Amy. You're reading with Jimmy. That was John Steinbeck's Johnny Bear. The entire reading. Thank you for listening. Learn by watching our video analysis of this story. And remember, if you have questions, email me, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Thank you so much.